But when I was 5, I remember very distinctly my father coming into my bedroom around 2 o'clock in the morning, and he took me by the hand, led me out into the living room, and sat me down on the couch with my mother, and told me flat out that, and he didn't call them extraterrestrials, he called them creatures. And he said they absolutely existed. He described what they looked like to me, told me what the spaceships looked like, and then after he told me all of that, he put this little disclaimer on it saying that I could never tell anybody what I knew because it would cause a panic and people wouldn't understand, and they might even consider me crazy for having said something, or that I was just a kid and I was, you know, making things up or having daydreams or whatnot. But he told me after saying that he wanted me to know the truth, and that it was a truth that I could know but nobody else could know at that point in time because it would cause a panic. Now, after he told me what he was doing and that these creatures existed, he didn't really ever talk to me again about it. He talked to my mother about it, and it took me years to get my mother to tell me anything, you know, because I was trying to piece things together from memories and all of that. And especially since my dad's demise is such a mystery to us. But as he got more involved towards the 1960s, he started talking to my mother about being worried about me because we were always in the desert, and you know, he was really paranoid about me being out there all by myself, and he would just scream and carry on if she didn't know where I was. And I don't think he ever really talked to her about the import of what his fears were. Later on, she told me that much of it was because what they were finding in these crash sites were a lot of children. A lot of them were hybrid, but many of them weren't. And I think he started thinking that maybe there was a chance that I could be abducted or something because he wasn't sure why they were there.
You were telling me once about when you were a little girl.
I'm sorry, what?
You were telling me once a long time ago about when you were a little girl. I think you were saying that you were living on the base at the time, and you had an experience where your mom and dad were visiting away.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. My dad and my mom decided they would leave me alone for the first time in my life. Just for a little while, half hour to an hour, they were going to run over to my aunt's house and then come right back. Well, I assured them I'd be fine, and they left. And I went back into my room after having locked the front door and everything, and I turned off the light in the bedroom. I wasn't afraid of the dark. I enjoyed the dark. And I had a little window behind my bed that had some moonlight shining in, so it wasn't totally dark in there. Anyway, I was just listening to Claire de Lune on the record player. And I think I was probably in there about 5 minutes or so before I was aware that there was this noise in my bedroom. And it was kind of a staticky electricity kind of a noise, but it grew in intensity. And as it became louder, I became more focused on where it was coming from. It was coming from my closet. And it was a relatively good-sized closet, and the door was open. Again, I wasn't taken to nightmares or envisioning monsters or anything like that. I was too mature for a little kid, way more mature than most kids would have been considered at the time. And I just kind of sat up in my bed, and I reached over and I turned my record player off because I wanted to make sure it wasn't some static off of my record player. Sure enough, the sound was coming from the closet, and as I watched the closet and the open space that was there, and I could see the different shades of darkness that were there, you know, with the clothes and everything. The noise just got louder and louder and louder. And then all of a sudden, the noise stopped, and there was just a clicking sound. But it was not it was not rhythmic. It was kind of arrhythmic. A couple of clicks, then one, and so on. And then there was a shape. It just appeared. Just a shape appeared in my closet. And I really stood up and took notice that. I didn't actually get out of bed, but, I really came to attention. And I jumped up on my bed with my knees under me and my feet against the wall and my back against the wall and my hands against the wall. And I was just totally pressed back there in a state of tension, watching this wide-eyed as this dark shadow appeared in my closet. And I realized at the same time that there was no way out of my closet if there was a person in there, because that's what I thought it was at first. The door was right next to the closet, and my door was closed. And there was only this window behind me, and we were on the second story, and if I would have jumped out, I would have probably killed myself. It was concrete down below. So I just kept my attention on what I was seeing, hoping that there was nothing really there. And to my shock and utter surprise, what it was kind of moved out. It bent down and moved out and stood straight up. And it was taller than my closet. I would estimate that the ceiling in that particular place was 7.5 feet tall, maybe even a little taller than that. And this entity, this dark form, was almost as tall as the ceiling was. And I just kept my eyes riveted on this thing, and my heart was pounding right out of my chest. And I watched it, and as I watched it, it hunkered down a bit and spread its arms out to both sides. One arm was so close to the door that was to my right and to its left that I knew right then and there that I would definitely not be able to get out of the room by that route if I tried, at least not then. And then the other arm was spread out but curved in a little bit more. It looked like it was trying to prevent me from going anywhere. And then I became aware of it moving towards me, but it moved in such slow increments. I mean, such tiny increments that I was hardly even aware of the movement. It's just all of a sudden I would realize it was closer. And then it got closer, and I became more and more frightened because I still didn't know what it was, and it was getting closer, and it looked like it was trying to catch me at that point, and that freaked me out. All kinds of scenarios were running through my head at that time in terms of escape or, what it might try to do, who it was, why it was there. When my parents were coming back, I was alone. It didn't seem like I had any options. I felt like a rat, trapped in a corner. It was a very, very frightening situation for me. And as an 11-year-old kid, it's really pressing. You're trying to find a way out of a really what I considered at the time to be a desperate situation. And part of the fear that I felt was just the way it was moving toward me. It was so stealthy. It was like a cat, something wild trying to sneak up ever so gently upon something before pouncing. And that was extremely scary. As it moved closer, it got about halfway to me, and I couldn't tell you how long this took because I wasn't focusing on time at all. It could have been minutes. It could have been much longer than that. But my body was increasingly tense, and all of a sudden, part of it came into the shadow of the light that was coming through that window, and what I saw, I wasn't prepared to see, because this thing was reptilian. It had a totally human form in every respect, in terms of, you know, the appendages and the configuration on the body and all of that. But I got a very brief glimpse of the side of the face, including one of the eyes and part of the mouth, and the hand that was outstretched to the left of me and to its right. It had claws, and that clicking sound had stopped by the time it got to that part of the bed. And it still was going very slow, but as soon as I saw the fact that it was not a human being, I just totally freaked. And right at that instant, I thought I was lunch, and I just wanted to get out of the room, and I pushed with all of my might against the wall with my feet and my hands, and I bounded off the bed and just scraped by its claws on its left hand. It threw open the door, whipped around the corner, got into the bathroom and locked it. I had all these bedclothes that were tangled around my feet and everything. I was trying to get through them and dragging some of them in with me. Scared to death that this thing was going to get me before I could get away. And as soon as I'd locked the door, not thinking that if it could get into my bedroom, it could get into the bathroom, I thought I was safe in there. I hunkered down between the wall and the toilet. There was just this very small space, but boy, I shoved my little pudgy body in there really fast and just hyperventilated my little life away until I heard kind of a jiggle on the door, and yet it wasn't. This creature, whatever it was not trying to get into the door. And I thought about it just very briefly and then panicked out because it started making these scratching noises on the outside of the door, just going right from the very top of the door frame all the way down very slowly to the bottom of the door. It did it 3 or 4 times. And then I heard the key in the front door and my mother and my father's voice. And they came in, and the scratching stopped, and I heard my dad call my name, and then my mother call my name. I just was so petrified. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I could hardly breathe. I didn't know what I had just been through. I couldn't fathom the danger that I was in, and I was worried at that point that my mom and my dad were in danger, but there was nothing I could do. You know, it was like this little survival mechanism kind of turns on in you, and everything else turns off. And I just didn't want to. I didn't want to be around whatever this was. And then, as my mother and my father, I could hear them walking down the hall calling me, and I wasn't answering, so they became more frantic. And they started screaming at that point, and then my father goes, "Oh my God," at the top of his lungs and just running down the hallway. And my mother is screaming at the top of her lungs for me. They'd both seen, because from our front door to the bathroom door was a straight line shot of vision. And gosh, how many feet? Maybe 30 feet, maybe a little less. But if you just come into the door, you wouldn't notice it until you got a little closer, and then you would have seen it. But anyway, they got to the door, and they looked. You know, they looked in my room first, and I wasn't there. And by that time, I realized, you know, that I could probably get up and everything. I was safe because it was my dad, John Wayne, after all. And if there was anything there, he'd take care of it, hopefully. And then I opened the door, and I mean, I had tears streaming down my face. I was covered in tears and shaking so badly I could hardly speak. And when I opened the door, I saw these deep grooves that had been just carved into the door by this hand with claws, and it had just made curls down to the bottom of the door frame. And it was a very, very, very scary and freaky situation, made even more intense by my father's reaction to it, because he said, "That's it. This is over. we're getting out of here. We're moving right now. And we did. We moved immediately after that. And as far as I know, my dad didn't have any more investigation calls. It's like everything stopped right then and there, and we moved down to San Diego. Thinking about it, and I thought, if that thing had really wanted me, it could have had me at any time. If it could get into my bathroom and my bedroom, you know, there would have been no problem. If it really had wanted me, what we ended up theorizing was that it was trying to scare my father away from something that he was working on, and that was the way they came up with doing it.
Well, that makes sense to me, that it was merely trying to frighten him away.
Right. And it did. It stopped every single thing that he was doing from that point on.
And then you said that that your father's demise was strange.
Very.
Can you talk about that for just a few moments?
Sure. In 1964, my dad started having an ulcer problem that was somehow related to a bullet wound that everybody said was impossible for him to have had because he was never in combat. And anyway, he ended up going into Balboa Navy Hospital after having a hemorrhage. And they did an operation, took a portion of his stomach out, and he was recovering for a while with no problems. And at the time, he was very, very upset. He was extremely agitated. I had told you earlier that he had been telling my mother that if he ever went into any military installation for any reason where he was helpless, that he would not come out alive. Or the other scenario that he gave her was that they would re-induct him because of what he knew, and that she would never see him again. And I heard them talk a number of times. You know, I was young. I was 14. I wasn't totally conscious of the impact and the import of what they were talking about the few times that I heard them. But I was always very, very aware of my father's fear. And when he went into this hospital, it became even more evident because he started talking about it more. He didn't want my mother to leave his side. She had to know everything that they were doing, every procedure, what was going to happen, not to let them give him any medications that she didn't approve, on and on and on and on ad infinitum. And an interesting occurrence that I wasn't totally aware of at the time either until after I talked years later about it to my mother, was that a lot of the other high-ranking officers that were in the same ward that he was in started dying one by one. And they were all in the hospital for relatively minor complaints. And I think there were 4, maybe 5, including my dad. And my mother had been talking to all of these women, the wives of these different men. And within a 2-week period, this whole ward was gone.
Did they quickly sicken and die?
Pardon?
Did they quickly sicken? You know, they had a in for, you know, as your father was recovering, then all of a sudden take a severe relapse and.
Very, very much so. It's like he
sounds like psychotronic or microwave weapons were used.
He was so good one night on a Friday.
Just like
we
falling
went
off a cliff.
home. It was the first time that we'd gone home in 2 weeks, and that was the 25th, I believe, of July, 1964. And we came back the next morning, and my father was in the intensive care ward.
Yeah.
And yet when I talked to him that morning, he seemed perfectly fine, but he was very agitated. He wanted to see my mother, and he kept saying, I saw something, Nancy, you've got to go get your mother for me right now. So I went to get my mother. She came back to talk briefly with my dad, and then she went away for a few minutes. By the time she got back, we were in the waiting room, and you know they have the windows where you can see into the ICU, I think is what they call it. Anyway, all hell broke out in the ICU, where the entire 2 weeks that we were there, you could hardly find a doctor, you could hardly find an orderly. You could hardly find a nurse. All of a sudden, there were so many people in there that you couldn't walk anywhere. And we tried, my mother tried to get through the door, and someone came and blocked her entry. And my dad was the only person in the ward, so what was going on we knew was happening with my dad. And she had told me right then, she said, your dad saw a bunch of lights, and he was trying to tell me about it, and she didn't get a chance to talk to him. So we were waiting there for a few minutes. A couple minutes later, a doctor came in and looked at my mother and said, I'm sorry, Mrs. Malone, your husband has expired. And my mother looked at him in return in disbelief and said, what are you talking about? What are you saying? My husband has expired. What does that mean? And he would not say that my dad was dead. He said, your husband has expired, and he repeated it. And my mother went through the roof because, like I said, she was paranoid the whole time we were there. My dad was paranoid the whole time we were there. And she said, okay, fine. If he's dead, let me see the body. They said, I'm sorry, Mrs. Malone, it's against Army regulation. They would not let my mother in to see my father. My mother decided she would wait until the body got to the morgue. So we waited around a couple of hours. My mom's trying to think what could have happened, what she could do, what the scenario is. Got down to the morgue. They would not let my mother see the body. We went home that afternoon. Somebody had ransacked our apartment, had taken every paper my mother had pertaining to my father that was in the apartment. Little did they know my mother had a bunch of other papers at my aunt's house, but all of the papers that we had that were in the house were gone, all of his military papers. She started calling the Army, congressmen, anybody she could think of, the hospital, trying to tell people what was going on and that there was something screwy, that she didn't believe it. Nobody would respond to her. They just started threatening her. After that, we started getting lots and lots and lots of threatening phone calls. 2 days later, after she had made arrangements with the funeral parlor to have an open casket funeral, and they had agreed, we go to have the funeral, and they had a closed casket, and my mother said, what's going on here? They said, we're sorry, we've been told by the military that you cannot have an open casket funeral. So we went through the whole funeral process, and after everybody had left, and my mother and I were the only ones who were left there, one of the workers, we assume, that was there, one of the guys who, takes care of the casket and everything going into the ground, came up to my mother backwards very slowly and talked over his shoulder to her and said, is that supposed to be your husband? And she said, yes. He says, there's no body in that casket. To this day, we don't know what's happened. My mother tried to get an exhumation and was refused. And after we started getting all of the threatening phone calls and everything, my mother got very, very frightened that something was going to happen to me because I guess they threatened my life to her. And so she became very, very low profile after that, and we eventually left. But before we left, my mother left me at a friend's house saying that she was just going to be gone a little while because she had to think about things. She was going to go to the beach. My mother went to the beach. She said she fell asleep on the beach that afternoon. 2 weeks later, my mother came back to me and said that she just awoke on the beach. My mother lost 2 weeks of time. I was stuck at a friend's house for 2 weeks right after my father died, not knowing where my mother was. It was the worst time of my life. It was so scary. And after that, my mother wouldn't talk about anything anymore. We moved from place to place to place for the longest time. And she went to look for an uncle of mine, and he said he'd protect her, and he lived with us, and he took care of me. And we eventually settled in Whittier, California. But my mother went through some of the most horrendous things I could imagine anybody going through in their life after that happened. It was very bizarre. And we even saw a man after my dad had been supposedly buried. A man kept showing up across the street from our apartment for about a month after this happened. Looked so much like my dad, except he had his hat pulled over his face, and he was always standing in shadows. But I saw him the first time about a week after it happened, and I pointed him out to my mother, and as soon as she swore it was my father, and she tried to run across the street to go to him, and the guy would take off, but he kept showing up again. And, you know, just at different places, this man would be following us around, and then one day he wasn't there anymore.